Welcome back to Tending to Talks. After a very generous summer break I have given myself. Today my guest is Dr. Kari Grain, the author of Critical Hope, How to Grapple with Complexity, Lead with Purpose, and Cultivate Transformative Social Change, published in 2022, and a faculty member at the University of British Columbia, where she leads the Master of Education program in Adult Learning and Global Change. She also serves as a research associate at Simon Fraser University's Community Engaged Research Initiative. Her research focuses on experiential learning, critical pedagogy, adult education, anti-racism, and global/local community engagement, and has been featured in peer-reviewed journals, books, blogs, and podcasts. Dr. Grain, thank you for being here with me today. I invited you to record this episode because the title of your book, Critical Hope, evoked in me a whole range of emotions, which then, of course, led me to read it. I wasn't just in awe of the title. And I found the book to be very current and very fundamental. One of the things I loved about it is that it's not another 100 solutions to change the world, right? Instead, it calls for internal work, so to speak. It promises effort because for once we're invited by you to reflect not only on the state of the world, but also on our own existential condition. And hope being perhaps one of the most intimate drivers of change, it is in fact a critical resource. And with that idea, you have managed to convince a deconstructivist like myself to seek as much change within as without. So here we are. And with that short introduction, let's get into it. Right. In the book, you mentioned the risk of naive hope versus critical hope. I think most of us can imagine what naive hope might feel or look like. But what is critical hope? Could you share a moment with us in your own life or work where you realized the importance of moving from a naive sense of hope to a more critical one? And what did that look like?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me and for inviting me to be here. I was listening to some of your previous podcasts, and before I said yes, I wanted to hear, the sorts of topics that you're interested in and how you are as an interviewer. And I really appreciate the sort of the critical approach that you bring to this work, and also that you keep the emotions and the humanness present in some of these academic ideas, right? So for me, my background is in education. I'm first and foremost an educator. And I did my PhD in education. So for me, education is really this endeavor of hopefulness. And I think people who are committed to education or mentoring or coaching or parenting, anywhere where education is central, it really is this forward-looking investment in systems and people and hearts and minds. So I think it's like hopeful at its very core. Now, I have had, you asked me, for specific moments. I have had educators throughout my life who've taught me like different lessons about hope. And maybe I can just name a few of those people or like experiences I had with them. I had a high school librarian who once saw me reading Emily Dickinson at lunch hour. She's a poet, for those who don't know. And she wrote this lovely poem called "Hope is the Thing with Feathers That Perches in the Soul." And so she saw me reading that, and she said, Kari, she loved gardening, the high school librarian, and she brought me, the following week, she had dug up some bulbs from her garden, and they were snowdrop bulbs. And if I know that you read the book, so you know that that this was like particularly powerful for me. But snowdrops are kind of this very special flower in that they come out of the soil, they're courageous. They arrive earliest in the year. You know, for someone that lives in Canada, that first flower of the year is so important because it means the hardest part of winter is over, usually. And so I think, you know, that was one educator in my life who taught me that. I had another teacher who taught me a different lesson about hope, and that was his name was Mr. Brooks, and he was an English teacher. And he made every kid in that class feel like they were worthy. And I was used to being in classes. I was someone who got good grades in most of my classes, but I loved watching how he made every student feel valued and valuable, and that every student had something to say. Because I had witnessed many times, you know, we identify certain students as troublemakers or as not very smart, and then that expectation that you put on them, they fulfill that. And I didn't see that in Mr. Brooks's class, or I actually saw that he put this expectation that they had something beautiful to write, that they could say something of value. And most of the time, because of that belief he had in them, they delivered. And he was not like, he's the opposite of somebody you would consider to have naive hope. Like he came across as cynical, he was kind of harsh, and he was tough, and he demanded more of everybody. But because he demanded more, I saw that everybody delivered. And I thought that was a really special lesson. And then I had this other professor named Dr. Rodriguez in university in my undergrad. And she walked into class on the first day, um, playing her guitar and singing. The course was on Indigenous education. And she was Indigenous, and she walked in playing her guitar and singing in quite a shaky voice. You could tell she was nervous, but she strolled through the rows of students and sang in her first language. And that class just blew my mind because it was about unlearning so many assumptions we make about what education is, right? Um, and I'm getting to the part where I talk about that critical piece, because I also had a professor during graduate studies who she said, you need to leave this idea of hope behind, because that's not what education is for, and that's not what it's about. And she said, if we have hope in a system that's broken, then we're just complicit in perpetuating that system. And for me, I came to realize that there's actually sort of critical hope in dismantling systems and in reimagining other ones. So when I started reading about critical hope, which was actually after that conversation she and I had, I started reading Paulo Freire's ideas. He coined the term. And it was like I was given permission to hold the injustices and the anger and the grief in the same space as hopefulness, and to really focus. It's less about how you feel and so much more about how you take action to change systems that are not working for everyone. And I realized that, you know, anger and grief and hope can be co-conspirators, and they can be allies in systems changes. So really, I think in many ways, my Western education, or in the global North, whatever it is, how I had been socialized, I was like duped into thinking that you're either hopeful and naive, or you're cynical and educated. So I guess critical hope became this conceptual space where I was allowed to feel the entanglement of hopefulness and all of the complexities of the world.
Right, because so often the sort of approach that Western science has towards hope is the idealization and the romanticization of it versus the scientific part, right? And the rationalism. And I'm so glad that you've mentioned Paulo Freire, because I think for those who are familiar with critical pedagogy, the notion of critical hope will be something very natural. For those perhaps
Yeah.
who are not familiar with critical theory, it could be like, oh, what is this thing? But yeah, I think my first thought when I read your book was that to write a book about hope, one has to be very hopeful, right? For a lot of reasons. One also has to be very brave, I think. And So my next question is, how do you personally navigate this tension between staying hopeful and recognizing the gravity of world's challenges? Like, how can we, following your example, maintain hope when truth becomes overwhelming or paralyzing?
Oh man. Well, the first thing I want to say is that I actually don't suggest that people try to maintain hope all the time. I really think that that's where some conversations about hopefulness can go wrong, is this expectation that feel hopeful all the time, because that's just not the truth, generally speaking. If I were to suggest anything for others, it would be to accept that our relationship to hope is continually going to change throughout life. And depending upon systemic barriers, depending upon the body that we are in and how society values that body, and how social systems support that body. It can be in relation, our feelings about hope are in relation to chemicals in the body and hormones. And people who experience mental illness or depression will know that there are all sorts of things beyond one's control that govern how hopeful one feels. And that might be, again, within the body, but it can also be in the systems outside of the body. Current events, personality traits. Some people are, you might just meet somebody who has a very specific tendency towards hopefulness or something else, right? So yeah, I wouldn't say that we should maintain hope all the time. I think that's kind of what toxic positivity is when we shame folks who aren't there, who aren't feeling that hopefulness. I often use this metaphor of a grappling hook or some kind of an anchor. So if we think about ourselves as a boat on this ocean, and this ocean is always changing and moving depending on the tides and the relationship to the moon and the systems that are passing through. And maybe hope is this other vessel, or maybe it's a dock. But in any case, we're linked to it with this rope. And sometimes that relationship is going to be very peaceful. And if the water is calm, then we can hold ourselves really closely to hope, and it's probably going to be fine. But in really stormy waters, that closeness to hopefulness can be a liability, right? And if you think about it as this physical object, it can gouge a hole in our boat, in our vessel. It can pull us somewhere in the wrong direction. So I think critical hope, part of the work of critical hope is tending to that relationship and allowing it to go through different phases. And then trusting ourselves enough that we can pull ourselves closer to hope when we have the strength, and when we have the community around us that can help us with that, and when the seas are a bit calmer. So I really do think it is this shifting relationship rather than something we should retain all the time.
Much of critical hope challenges the idea that we need to fix everything, right? Instead, you seem to advocate for a deeper relationship with ambiguity and uncertainty, for a hope that is far from perfect, that doesn't seek perfection. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, this idea of fixing everything. I don't know if you've heard the proverb, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I've witnessed and I've been a part of, I think at times, well-meaning people and well-meaning projects that can turn out to have negative consequences. I often think of my master's research, which was in Rwanda, and my doctoral research, which happened in Uganda. Both of those projects, even though they were distinct, they both looked at volunteer education programs where typically privileged Western students, folks from the global North, they carry out placements in East Africa. Sometimes it was for 3 months, sometimes for 12 months. And on the one hand, I teach in a university now, and sometimes I teach students who are about to go out on those placements. So on the one hand, it is so amazing to meet these students who come into this program and who have, a variety of reasons for why they were drawn to do this placement. And some of them, you know, come into my classroom saying, I want to do something with my privilege. I want to, I don't just like want to carry on with my life and not see how others live. You know, I want to examine inequality, or I want to see, I want to help people, right? This is the classic one, the salvationist approach. And so, you know, I've realized that it's it's actually my job to slow them down, to ask them to interrogate their assumptions and say, like, why is it that you're so drawn to do this? And not to make them feel terrible for those assumptions. And again, I try to use myself as an example, because I remember being a 21-year-old student and wanting to go volunteer in Africa. And I wish I had had somebody stop me and say, hey, you should make sure that the community that you're going to are leading this program, and that you have positioned yourself appropriately as a learner, or that you have, you know, learned about the culture where you're going. Maybe you've learned a few words in their language and not expecting them to speak English the whole time if it's not an English speaking place. So yeah, I think part of my job as an educator, helping to prep students before they go on certain placements, and they could be local placements as well. Anytime they're encountering situations of inequality, situations of marginalization or injustices, they have to be willing to navigate that uncertainty and to even doubt and question all of the cherished assumptions they have arrived with. Right. And I think it's easy to think that that situation of equality is what needs to be changed, when maybe it's like this entire worldview that is built upon capitalism that needs to be reimagined, right? So yeah, I would definitely say that ambiguity and uncertainty are uncomfortable. And yet they are a really core part of critical hope and the work of critical hope.
And perhaps even if the world needs to be changed, it doesn't need to be changed by us and in this very specific
Exactly.
way that we imagined, right? So
Right.
always, yeah, always seeking the problematic and setting things in the context. Well, that's something that unfortunately not a lot of educators do.
Oh, well, yeah, I guess it depends where you are, and you know, where and how people have been trained. But I definitely have, I've learned a lot of these things from educators during my own graduate work, because again, like, I didn't enter this work from a space of critical hope or critical pedagogy. I really entered this work through like wanting to change the world and thinking I was the person to do it. And I really needed some people to challenge me and to slow me down, and to realize that sometimes action, sometimes the most important form of action is listening. And unlearning and deconstructing. You mentioned you're a deconstructivist. Well, sometimes that's the hardest work to do. And it's the work that needs to be done. And
It,
there are also times for action, of course. There are times for other forms of action as well.
it feels endless, but it feels endless because there's just so much that needs to be undone before we start taking action again, right? In the book, you mentioned these 7 principles for practicing hope, and it's especially the number 4, 5, and 6 that really resonated with me. But I'll read out the sixth one because I would like to ask you to elaborate on it because I thought it was really interesting. Critical hope requires interruptions and invitations. I thought that was really interesting. What do you mean by that? Interruptions and invitations.
So again, I'm speaking through the lens of an educator. I think that I learned this lesson through my students, from my students, because it's so um, instinctive, I suppose, for me as an educator to interrupt harmful assumptions when I see them in my classroom or when I hear them, right? And I have really realized that if you interrupt students without having an invitation for them, a pathway. I've said to them, this pathway is not where you should be walking, or that thought process is flawed potentially for these reasons. But if we don't also offer them a way to be a part of a movement, a way to be a part of that learning community, then I think it really contributes to the polarization that we sometimes see, whether it's in classrooms or in broader society, political society. And I want to acknowledge that there are, different educators, again, depending upon one's identity and positionality, there might be different levels of invitations that people can offer. So I've talked about I've talked with groups of high school principals about this particular idea. And they were mentioning certain parents who will come to these school meetings and be really, they're so angry that there will be a move to protect gay and trans students in the school. And some parents will show up and be very angry that this is happening. I have no problem interrupting that behavior from the parents. And we will stop any toxic things that they're saying about our gay and trans students. But I don't want to invite them. Like, it feels very difficult for me to invite them to an alternative possibility. And I think that's where some of the work is. And because what we have to do is recognize that we might disagree with these people on a very foundational level. But if we turn them away completely, they might become even more extreme. And yet, if we can offer them an inroad to the movement, to the acceptance, then they don't feel fully rejected. Now, again, I don't think everybody has the capacity to do this. So for me, as a white person, I have more, I think, of a responsibility to interrupt white supremacy when I see it. And I wouldn't expect the same level of any kind of like invitation type behavior from my friend or colleague who is teaching that same group of students, if they are a racialized teacher, right? So there are differences in how we invite and interrupt. But yeah, I think both are really important.
Yeah, and this is how I understood it. It reminded me of this thing that Petra Cooper's. I did an episode with her a few months ago. She's a community performance activist, and she said that whenever she's working with a group, she always asks the question of who is not with us today.
Mm.
And I thought invitations and interruptions is essentially just a different way of saying the same thing in that regard, isn't it? I love how you
Yeah.
say that you feel you are in a place to interrupt some, but perhaps not others. And on that note, how do you approach the relationship between critical hope and privilege? How might the experience of hope differ for someone with more privilege compared to those in marginalized and oppressed communities?
Yeah, this is a really interesting conversation. It's probably one of the areas I thought most deeply about, because when I was invited by North Atlantic Books to write this book, they had read an article I'd written on critical hope, and they felt that I was the right person to write a whole book on it. And I said no at first, and they were like, "Well, we don't usually have people saying no to a book offer. Like, why are you saying no?" And first of all, I did think it was a scam at first. But secondly, once I realized it wasn't a scam, um, I said to them, I don't know, I come from, middle class Western Canada, white European roots. And I just felt something quite uncomfortable about the idea of like a fairly privileged white voice talking about hope and hopefulness, because I see hope as this highly political topic that is imbricated in systems of power. And um, they helped me see that I can talk about this and I can raise this up within the book, and I can talk about how systems of power are linked to critical hope. So that's what I tried to do. Funny enough, the chapter that we have on the neuroscience of critical hope actually helped me link the most political aspects of hopefulness. I want to say as a caveat, I'm not a neuroscientist, okay? But I can say that our brains create predictive models of the world based on our experiences. And so you might call those neural pathways, but our brains create expectations based on our experiences. And if we have a whole lifetime of experiences where we've been valued, where we haven't fallen through the cracks, where we felt secure in a school setting, maybe where we felt safe on our walk to school, if we have these experiences that are quite positive, it's actually just a continuation of these really entrenched brain patterns that we would expect good things out of life if that has been our experience. Now, if on the other hand, you've experienced trauma right from a young age, if you've experienced racism or marginalization or insecure housing or food insecurity, these types of situations contribute to a lack of feeling safe. I'm going to try to get just briefly into the brain science of it. From what I understand, is that the prefrontal cortex it's like the imagination station. It helps us with problem solving. It helps us with navigating new situations and imagining what barriers we might face and how to get around them in advance of facing those barriers. So it's really a space where a lot of imagination happens. It's great if that prefrontal cortex is able to do the work of those things. Now, the amygdala is like the alarm center of the brain. And if somebody is experiencing, as I mentioned before, trauma or a lack of safety, they are not able to really focus on the work of the prefrontal cortex where the imagination and hopefulness happen. They're focusing on survival. So the amygdala is telling them, fight, flight, fawn, or freeze. And it's actually taking them away from the work of hope and imagination. So you can see how many experiences compounding over time, if you are in a situation of marginalization or a situation where you've been treated systematically unfairly by whether in a social situation or by society, it is likely that that will continue on. And sometimes I get frustrated when I see people scolding others for being unhopeful or for being cynical. And often that cynicism is just somebody's brain saying, I've seen this before 100 times, and I know how it turns out for me. And that's very true based on that person's, the collection of their experiences. And I just find that aspect really fascinating. Now, it does happen where people are able to absolutely overcome. Like some of the most hopeful people I have met in my life have come from childhoods that were very challenging or from situations where they were facing discrimination. But the difference is that they actually have to work exponentially harder to generate hopefulness and than somebody who's just experienced great thing after great thing. And I think that this is where we see the difference between like equality and equity, these different notions, right? That we don't necessarily all start from the same place.
And my next question for you was on how do you see the role of vulnerability in fostering hope? And I think that this somehow relates to what you were just saying. Is there a point where vulnerability becomes detrimental to maintaining hope?
I think vulnerability and the capacity for vulnerability are so personal. I am somebody, you've read my book, you saw how vulnerably I wrote in that book. I'm somebody that has always felt, in some ways, I almost want to say safer in my vulnerability because I want people to see and understand me fully and to understand the context from which I am speaking. And so I shared, one of the things I shared towards the beginning of my book was that when I signed the contract to write the book Critical Hope, I was experiencing a miscarriage. I had just gone through a miscarriage. And for those audience members who have ever experienced a miscarriage, for me, it was one of the emptiest and probably most hopeless situations I've ever felt. It's the promised future that you thought you had, but it's also like your body dealing with all of the hormones and like the sort of cleansing of a lot of things that were going to originally create life. And so for me, I did think twice. I thought many times, am I sure I want to include this story about my miscarriage in the book? But I wanted people to know that I'm not writing, I'm not writing this from a place of just feeling great about life, although I think that there is some hopefulness involved in writing a book on hope. I also think that if you haven't walked through despair, you might not know hope very well. And I think everybody has different experiences they've had where they have felt broken open or where they have felt their world has fallen apart. And I really do believe that those experiences they don't always, but they can contribute to a much deeper understanding of what hope is and how it operates in your own life. So I would say that for me, vulnerability has felt like an incredible way to connect with others. I have, in my vulnerability, others have contacted me when they read the book and said, thank you for writing that. It meant a lot to me because other people had never talked about this or that. And I didn't, reading your book made me feel less alone. Somebody said that to me. And that's about the greatest gift I could hope for as an author. That I helped one person get through a really difficult moment in their life. I will say that vulnerability is not for everybody. Too much vulnerability can be a lack of boundaries. And boundary work is something I've had to work on in my life. What am I willing to share with others and what do I want to hold and keep private for myself? And I think every person has work to do in different ways on how vulnerable they're willing to be.
In the book, you also highlight the importance of staying grounded in both reflection and action. What advice would you give to people who feel stuck in this cycle of critical reflection without being able to sort of translate that into meaningful action? For deconstructivists like myself, who sometimes spend a little bit too much time on divagating
Right.
how, yeah, how things should be and how they're not, and essentially how to move from this ever-present feeling of disillusionment, maybe, and towards active cultivation of how do we make it habitual?
One of the concepts I talked about in my book is this idea of relentless incrementalism. And this, I think sometimes folks feel like the problems of the world are so huge. How could I possibly begin, or how could I possibly make an impact on anything? I don't even know where to start, or I'm just a cog in the wheel. And one of the things in working with groups or going around and doing keynotes is, I hear people say this a lot, that they feel like they're not empowered enough to make the systemic changes that they would like to make. And I really feel that sometimes we don't even see our own power. We don't even see, because we're in it, because we're in a community, we don't even see what that community is. But often people have influence, even if it's just within their own little family, even if it's just within their tiny little workplace. Maybe there's one thing you're in charge of, but that one thing could be a place for a small change to be made that could contribute to sustainability, or could contribute to social justice, a shift in policies, a different way to spend resources so that it gets to community more. Like there's all sorts of small things that can be done from 1,000 different places, right? My colleague, Dr. Dustin Louis, he's an Indigenous scholar of education and decolonization. And he has been using some of the content from my book in his work on decolonizing education, but through an Indigenous lens. He's been applying it through an Indigenous lens. And he asked if I would author a paper with him on like, how do we create a framework for what relentless incrementalism is? And we've been working on this almost like spiral with different levels. And what we think about a lot is just that so much of taking action is at this very first core level, which is ways of being. Like before we get into ways of doing, we need to think of the ways that we are being. And so something that Dustin has brought into that work really strongly is relational accountability. So how am I being accountable to the relationships in my life? And and that's not just relationships with people, that's relationships with land and animals and the future and the past. Thinking of ourselves as relational beings who have accountability to others, but also communities of solidarity. A lot of folks might feel isolated and think that they have to work alone on an issue, and then a fairly quick internet search will help you realize that there are already people working on this, and maybe you could get involved in what they're doing instead of trying to create your own isolated thing. So I think ways of being that are centered around humility and relationships can really start us off in a good way before we get into that next layer of ways of doing. And of course, it's tempting to think that we need to make huge changes. And yeah, when it comes to the climate crisis, we need huge policy changes worldwide. It's an emergency. And there are some people who have the power to make those giant policy changes. And there are millions of people who just have the power to make small changes in their own lives. But collectively, it can move mountains. And so I think part of the work of an educator or of an activist or somebody who's trying to create change is figuring out, how do we bring people together, and what are some small things we can collectively commit to together to create change in the direction we want to go. And then that third layer of relentless incrementalism actually has to do with renewal. So how do we, whether or not that radical change happens, we can never guarantee that the radical change we're aiming for through relentless incrementalism is going to happen. But regardless, we need to renew ourselves. We need to take a breath often in difficult activism work. When we're facing difficult realities, that renewal component, it's not just about keeping ourselves well, it's about checking in on our communities. It's about checking in on the problem that we were out to solve in the first place and seeing if we're still moving in the right direction. And it's about renewing our knowledge of the situation. So I think for me, this framework of relentless incrementalism and how we've built it out has really helped me to think through, how can an individual, how can one community take small actions toward radical change?
And for those who work in fields centered on social justice and activism, burnout is common. How do you think critical hope can help individuals in these spaces maintain resilience without ignoring or bypassing harsh realities?
Yeah, thank you for this great question. I see social justice activism as this incredibly broad and diverse field, because we have folks working on human rights and anti-racism and climate justice, Indigenous rights or decolonization, and so much more. And I think, again, I'll just bring this back to my role as an educator. And when I would teach a class of students, I have to recognize that different teaching styles are going to work well for some students and not for others. And I have asked students in the past, I had this one assignment where I asked students to identify a teacher who changed their life. And there was, in reading the answers, it was fascinating because there was actually no real trend in the type of teacher that changes students' lives, other than that they made them feel seen. That might be the only thing, they made them feel seen. But, some of the teachers people talked about were tough and harsh, some were gentle, some held space for their students, some were loud and gregarious, or some like led by example. But every person that talked about that teacher who changed their life said they felt seen by that teacher. And bringing it back to activism and social justice, I really believe that we need all sorts of ways for people to take part. And we need folks who are going to raise hell and shake systems loose. We need folks who quietly ask really hard questions. And we need folks who, you know, play music and compose songs and dance in the streets and are magnetic force for bringing others into the movement. And we need projects that highlight the grief of an unjust world, just as we need projects that highlight the possibilities, right? And I think the main thing is that folks have a way to get involved, or the main goal is that folks have a way to get involved from different positionalities and in different ways. I was recently listening to this other podcast, and somebody named Chia Bastida was on the podcast. She's an Indigenous youth climate activist. And I heard her talking about the power of imagination and the things we come up with in our minds, the ideas that we have, specific to the climate movement, though. And she said that, you know, all the cars and all the highways that we see, they were once somebody's thought, they were somebody's idea. So how can we think better things and imagine better things so that those things have an opportunity to become reality? And she really talked about, I thought she just so eloquently talked about the power of imagination. And she said, we have the power to shape our future every time we think and feel. So it's our duty to think beautifully and to feel beautifully. And I specifically, coming from her positionality and being a young person involved in the climate movement, I thought that this was like a teaching that we really need in the world right now.
The last question I have for you today is the following. After finishing the book and reflecting on its journey out into the world, has your own understanding of hope evolved? Are there any new dimensions of critical hope that you're exploring now after the book's release?
I've learned a lot. I've learned so much. I think I've been invited to speak in a lot of different places to very different groups of people. People working on the housing crisis and in addiction, people working on healthy campus communities, people. I was just in Washington, D.C. speaking at the Association for Research Libraries. So it was all of the executive directors of the research libraries of North America. And I think that it's interesting because it's this topic that is, I mean, hope is something that everybody understands and that there are strong feelings about, you know, especially based on people's life experiences. And one of the biggest lessons for me has been to, you know, offer this framework, offer these ideas as a tool for people who are already experts in their own lives and who are experts in the work that they're passionate about. And so I think like the greatest gift I've gotten is when people tell me these ideas helped me to continue on when I was ready to quit, you know, my climate activism, or I was ready to quit my anti-racism work, but I read this and it made me realize like it's okay to just pause for a bit and then come back to it. So for me, I hope that people just see it as the offering that it is. It's not meant to be prescriptive. It's really just an offering to people because I care about those who are doing social justice activism and climate activism. And I want them to be able to keep doing it, you know? And part of the ability to keep doing important work is that we attend to our own internal landscapes. I avoided the use of the term well-being because I think it's just so much more than that. It's an entire internal landscape. And then I think another way I wanted to add that probably the core way that my idea of hope has transformed it through my conversations with a lot of incredible people is just in realizing that hope, especially critical hope in particular, does not mean that you're being complicit in a system. Like, to have hope that things can get better does not mean that you're assuming you're going to use the same system that's not working. I think there is a lot of hope, even for people like the folks who are like, we need to burn it down. There is still a hope. I think people who believe that, there's a hopefulness in what comes when that broken system gets burned down and what comes after it. To say that that perspective is devoid of hope, or specifically critical hope, I think is false. I do believe that a lot of people who are passionate about social justice and climate action, they are coming from a place of passion and willingness to commit their lives to this work. And whether, it can be through so many different avenues that we do that. Yeah.
Right. And with that, as always, all resources, including Dr. Grain's website and a direct link to Critical Hope, are available in the episode description. A heartfelt thank you to my wonderful guest, and to you, my dear listeners, for dedicating these precious minutes of your day to asking questions and exploring new perspectives. If you choose to read Dr. Grain's book, which I wholeheartedly recommend, I wish for your hope to, I don't know, perhaps shift from this romanticized idol and inactive dream, if that is the case, into a powerful vessel for change, both within and beyond. Until next time.